Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Pine Lily meeting for this month. Today we have Dr. Patrick Bohlen of the University of Central Florida. He'll be discussing showcasing native plants in new developments. So we have monthly meetings. Right now we're online out of abundance of caution, but we are looking to introduce some in-person events very soon. So keep an eye on our Facebook page for updates. And without further ado, here is Dr. Bohlen.
Thank you. I share screen. So yeah, I'm glad to be here. I think I spoke to Pine Lily just a few months back, but I have a different theme I'm going to talk about today, and also get into some projects that I'm doing. So it's delightful to be here tonight, and thank you for the invite. And I'm going to share my screen. This presentation here. And oops, let's go show it. There we go. So hopefully my screen is being shared. So the theme I want to talk about tonight is kind of drawing on the theme of Silent Spring, which is written back in the 60s, obviously, and launched the environmental movement. But really to address this question of insect decline, which I'm sure everybody has heard about or is familiar with, to kind of explore that question a little bit. And then talk about can native plants help reverse this? Can we really use native plants to help address this larger issue, which is really kind of a global issue? What is the potential for that, and what are some of the associated questions and concerns that need to be thought through related to this subject? So the global environmental context for this is one that I share a lot with presentations I give anymore, because really there's only two things that really matter anymore when it comes to the global environment in any kind of substantial way, and that is global climate change and biodiversity loss. Obviously, these are big global issues. They affect us locally. They affect us at every scale of study or investigation or work in today's world. So the other thing we've realized about those two things is that they're interrelated. You know, we have United Nations panels such as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and also the Biodiversity Congress, are two separate aspects of global issues that the United Nations is dealing with that have been dealt with in separate kind of global meetings and documents and that sort of a thing. But just in the past few years, people have started to point out that these two things are very interrelated and in fact, difficult to tease apart. So really, they're the major things that are driving most of the concerns today. And so most of the ecological work we do, the environmental work we do, the scientific research we do, or the practical policies that we pass to address these issues are really the dominant issues of the day. One approach that was proposed back around the turn of the century in 2000 was this notion of ecosystem services, which has now become fairly well embedded in people's, certainly the jargon, and it's also pretty well embedded in the way people think about and communicate the importance of nature and natural systems to human life. And this was thought of as really falling into four separate categories, interrelated categories. One was supporting services, the other being the cultural, the provisional, and the regulating, the provisioning. Provisioning, obviously, the production of food, clean water, and that sort of a thing. The supporting the biodiversity, soil formation, and those kinds of things. Cultural, obviously, humans get a lot out of nature, and as all the members of FNPS know, that's one of their connections is the cultural connection to native plants. And then things like the regulating services of purifying water and cleaning air and all that kind of thing. So this is a concept that's used. It's useful to frame these kinds of issues, but these three major contexts, I think, provide the context for anything we're talking about when we're talking about ecological systems, plants, and animals on planet Earth. Most of you, I'm sure, have heard about this issue of insect decline. The big sort of sensational article that came out a few years ago, shown here in an article in The Guardian, was of a long-term study in Germany in which some amateur and semi-professional entomologists discovered over 25 years of monitoring that there was a significant decline, up to 75% decline in the abundance of insects in specific locations where people collected insects consistently from year to year to year. So they had a long-term database to work with. This prompted a lot of, well, this is in the Guardian. Obviously, there was a scientific paper involved. It involved a lot of public concern. It became very kind of sensationalized in the media. So you may have heard about it through the sensationalized media. And it's gone through a whole lot of iterations, people thinking about it. It's prompted funding agencies to get involved, new interest in insect conservation and that kind of thing. But in any event, it's something that came from this study and other studies. But the question really is, are something like as abundance insects really in decline? There is, as we're going to go through, a kind of not an exhaustive list, but examples documenting decline that have contributed to this notion that it is a more global issue that's happening everywhere and that everybody needs to be concerned about. And they go back, studies going back, this goes back to 2005, there were studies before this. This was just a study that came out looking at, in biological conservation, looking at the decline in common British moths. And a lot of the work was done in Britain, in fact, because they had a lot of long-term data sets, places like Germany and Britain that have a lot of long-term data sets, and consistent monitoring from year to year at different locations are ideal for this kind of analysis. So here's just looking at moths. If you're familiar with Doug Callamy's work, which we'll talk about a little bit later, moths are obviously very important, especially in the caterpillar stage. It's a major food source for birds and other wildlife. So here we see this decline. Here is a study from Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest in New Hampshire, where Nick Rodenhouse and his colleagues showed an 83% decline in abundance between these 2 years, these 2 periods of analysis. One thing I did want to note for this kind of study is that if you look at the time periods, there's a 4-year period for the first analysis, 73 to 77, and the next was 2 years. And one thing we will know if we look at any kind of animal population, including insects, year-to-year variability can be huge in insect analysis. Now, there's a multiple-year climatic event. You could have differences totally explained by that, not because there's some massive decline. In this case, they did relate the decline to climate change because this ecosystem is generally covered by snow, and snow warms the soil and protects kind of the overwintering sites for a lot of things. And when there's less snow, the soil freezes and it can kill things. So they tried to relate it back to, what was going on with snow cover, which has gone down dramatically in the northeastern US over the past several decades. There's an example from there. Here's a study in Ohio over a 20-year period showing a 33% decline in butterfly abundance in commonly monitored butterflies. Here is another study of insects in butterflies in the Netherlands. This went back to data going all the way back to 1890. And the graph on the left shows in 3 different types of ecosystems, woodland, grassland, and heathland, a steady decline over that time. And then the one on the right shows the heathland, where there's been the biggest decline, that you have especially a decrease in all species, including those that are still present, are declining in abundance, but there's also a lower number of species that's being observed. So this is a long-term study, again, that goes way back to almost 100 years of data they were looking at here. A study in Kansas showed a decline in grasshoppers in the tall grass prairie, and they also observed that this happened at the same time the grass biomass was going up. Again, this is believed to be driven by CO2 concentrations and changing rainfall patterns, but you've got an increase in plant biomass and a decrease in grasshoppers, and the thing they think is going on there is there's a decline in the nutritive content of the grass. Due to the increased growth stimulation, there's actually lower density of nutrients in the plant material. So in fact, grasshoppers growing on that grass are getting less nutrition than they were 30 years ago. For whatever it might be, they observed fairly consistent decline in grasshopper species in tall grass prairie. We all are familiar with the monarch butterfly, which is kind of the showcase poster child for pollinator decline. Here you see from 1995 to 2021. And I just saw yesterday that the Center for Biological Diversity had sued entities over the Fish and Wildlife over failure to act appropriately when it came to a variety of endangered species. And one of the species that they are under consideration is the monarch butterfly, which will be addressed in a future year, I believe, and this year, the listing of the gopher tortoise as a threatened species in Florida by the federal government is also being proposed. So in any event, we're familiar with this decline, and there's been some recovery of monarchs here and there, but it's still, they're very, very seriously under threat. Greater decline. Here's just bee species. I want to talk about bees in a little bit, but the bee species in Illinois sampled the top graph in 1916 and 1971, very similar. But then we look in the early 2000s, 2009, 10, a big decline in the number of bee species observed at the same locations. Here's a little graph from Europe showing that a third of bee and butterfly populations are declining. About 20% of those threatened species are endemic. And of course, in Florida, we know a lot of our species are endemic, both plant and animal. Wherever there's high endemism, we very often have problems with extinction. And about 10% of bee and butterfly species are endangered in Europe. So that's a pretty high number. We probably don't have a good sense of, as good a sense of that in the US, but Europe's seriously got a problem. The rusty patched bumblebee, which a northern kind of mid-central, north central and eastern species, was the first insect, first bee to be placed on the endangered species list in the continental US. And here this graph shows the dark red, purple spots is where it used to be. And then the yellow triangles is where the current population is. And the population modeling for this species actually shows that there's a very high risk of extinction. Here's just a modeling exercise some scientists did based on the current habitat, projected habitat change, and the populations themselves and how they're behaving, that they could be extinct in 30 to 40 years. So this is harkening back now. I'm showing you a lot of doom and gloom slides here. And so, you know, thinking about the silent spring, which was really about the birds not singing, maybe the bees not buzzing. In fact, pretty solid evidence in a lot of places. There's a decline in the number of species and the abundance of insects, which are the bottom of that food chain in the world that we occupy. There has been a counterpoint to these claims of decline. This is kind of a complex graph that's basically showing that, you know, how you interpret declines depends on your frame of reference. And if your frame of reference is 30 years, but before that 30-year period, and this example they're showing, what if you had a huge increase through some period of time, and then the period that you observed is shorter than that, and then you get this big interannual variability with these spikes and valleys can actually skew interpretations of time series over short periods. So they're basically taking a counterpoint that yes, in specific areas, mainly in urban areas and very heavily human dominated habitats, we've seen these declines. That's where they've been reported. But is it a global phenomenon? And do we really have the baselines that we need to determine over what time frame that decline has happened? And is it really, you know, that great a concern? Now, clearly, we're seeing extinctions and that sort of a thing. So it is obviously a serious concern. But this article raised some good points about whether or not the insect decline is real. And there's a lot of different ways that people look at these, everything from very scientific methods on the graph on the right here, all the way down to, you know, people counting butterflies in their garden and maybe loading them on some app or something like that. But we've all been involved in these various things, whether they're plant or animal, bio blitzes and that kind of a thing. The quality of your data changes, it gets low when you do the more public-oriented kind of data collection approaches, but you engage a lot more people. So part of the reason you do that is to engage people. So there's also a possibility for engaging citizen science here. And that's something, those are some of the data sets that scientists have to work with.
Hey, Dr. Bohlen. Is your microphone sort of near, like on the front of your computer? Because your volume is jumping up and down quite a bit. And so I was wondering if you could advance your slides with the arrow keys, and because I think it's causing a volume adjustment.
Oh, just with the arrow key?
Yeah.
Yeah, raise your hand if you hear that problem. So yeah, just raise your hand if you hear it again. Is the volume okay though, otherwise? Yeah, okay. Obviously we have a lot of reasons why insects are in decline, but it's an important question to ask because it's also how we interpret these trends and where they've occurred and whether they're real depends on that. We do have, in some cases, pathogens of insects are spreading. This could be due to introduction of invasive species or changing climate and putting more stress on insects. Pesticides are obviously a big issue. Yes. I wonder why that's happening. I'm all hooked up. My mic is there. Yeah, I shouldn't have any. Our internet should be strong here. Habitat loss and degradation is another bad one. Small population size. If you get these insects that are approaching extinction, you get small population sizes and fragmented habitat. And then climate change obviously is a major stressor that every organism has to adapt to. Obviously for the honeybee, we are familiar with the varroa mite as an obvious pest of that. So in this case, you've got more of an agricultural insect that's being attacked by a specific pest vector. Global pesticides, and this really gets back to Silent Spring, because Silent Spring was really focused on a lot of things, but really the use of pesticides, DDT in particular, and how that was being amplified through the food chain and harming things as large and as complex a predator as a bald eagle. But you can see we still use quite a lot of pesticide globally. And in the US, we use about 20% of the world's pesticides. So we're clearly putting a lot of pesticide out there. Now, you may know that after the big concern over DDT, a lot of chemical companies built and designed more targeted insecticides that had less generalized effects, could be targeted to specific groups, and also that tended to break down in the environment. And one of the reasons for this was because the persistence of DDT was one of the problems. And so, chemical engineers went to business designing pesticides that were more environmentally friendly in terms of their breakdown times. Well, a new class of insecticides, the neonicotinoids, which you've probably heard about, they're derived from nicotine-type compounds. These have been widely used, and what this graph shows basically is an estimate of the acute toxicity of pesticide loading in U.S. agricultural land. This would be like Corn Belt, but it would also apply to Florida and places where a lot of pesticides are used. And you can see since 1992, a huge increase in what they're calling the toxicity, the acute toxicity of the landscape, the agricultural landscape. And you see the blue bar, which increases over time. There at the top of the list is the neonicotinoid insecticides. Those are really problematic because they're systemic. They're pesticides that are absorbed into the tissues of the plant. And so any insect that eats that plant is exposed to them. And they have shown to persist, not as much as something like DDT, but they have some persistence in the environment as well. So this is a big issue. You're probably familiar with it if you're FNPS, but the toxicity of pesticides has not gone down due to the publication of Silent Spring. It has still gone up due to the expansion of intensive agriculture and the ability to devise new ways of going after pests, which are based on the most advanced biotechnology. Habitat loss is another one. Everybody in Florida has seen this a million times, but it does illustrate something I want to point out when you look at like trends in Europe. One of the differences between Europe and the US is Europe is very densely populated. We have huge regions of the US, like the Western US, that is not very densely populated if you look at the degree of urban area covering the landscape. But this is Florida, and this is where Florida is supposedly heading. Hopefully it won't get that far, but what this graph shows is that a good 30% of the landscape of this state is going to be occupied by urban, suburban, exurban development. And it's going to have we're going to have a much higher population density in 20 years than we do today. I haven't done the math of actually seeing whether that is going to compare to Europe. I should probably do that. But one of the things is it's just an intensification of the landscape. It's a human intensification of the landscape. And that causes structural changes in the landscape, in terms of the habitat, but also just what's occupied on the ground of the planet. Species introductions are big. We have a lot of invasive species and horticultural varieties that we bring into urban areas. And some of that leads to functional changes of the landscape. So you think of something like the heat island effect. You absorb more heat in an urban area. Therefore, you have more and higher temperatures. And then those each break down into even more detailed and more specific kinds of effects that ultimately add up to affecting native species diversity, the distribution of species, the demography, the life cycle, and the interactions of those species. So urbanization is a big one, and it's a big one for the state of Florida because we're a very urban state and we're becoming a more urban state, as is true of most coastal states. The thing with Florida is every acre is coastal. So we are a coastal state, so we have that high density kind of development that some other states don't. Thankfully, we also have a lot of natural land we've preserved, which does benefit conservation. So we have all of these assaults. This is just showing a bumblebee, but a lot of different assaults. Also in the case of pollinators, a reduction in floral resources. So the question is, can native plants make a difference for that? Obviously, native plants affect insects at different scales. If we are talking about something like natural systems, like the Ocala National Forest or the Apalachicola National Forest, we probably have a relatively intact ecosystem that is supporting the biodiversity that's always been there with the plants that have always grown there, at least for the several past tens of thousands of years. So those systems, obviously, they're native. They are native landscapes. There's no doubt that the existence of those ecosystems populated by those natural entities support native biodiversity. And then we go all the way down to the finest scale and the most intensive scale, which is the urban scale, where a lot of the plants that occupy those spaces are things that we choose and plant there intentionally. And there's everything in between, right? So the map there is showing the city of Orlando, huge areas of residential. We've got waterways, all these different complex landscape scales that we can look at these questions from. And obviously, you're all familiar with Doug Tallamy. His whole philosophy is based on the notion of bringing native plants back into these environments because of the huge land area that is occupied by human-occupied landscapes, urban, suburban landscapes. He has estimated it's equal to the 10 national parks in area, and that this is an area where we can have direct and significant impact by changing what we plant and how we manage them and what kind of pesticides we use, et cetera, et cetera. And so he's got this big motion for, bringing nature home. Obviously, great concept, and anybody in FMPS knows they probably tried to do it at their own houses and had some success at that it does work. And one of the driving themes of his whole approach and philosophy is that native plants are a food source for the herbivores that other animals eat. Here we see a little caterpillar eating our leaf. And that base of the food web, which is the plants at the bottom, the primary producers, those primary consumers, which are the caterpillars, are so important. And they have an evolutionary pre-adaptation to the plants that they have evolved with over hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. So those complex chemical interactions between the insect and plant are what drove insect diversity to begin with. And so you've got these very tailored relationships between what eats what pollinates what, and then you have some generalists in there as well. So that then those secondary consumers, like the little mouse shown here, could also be a bird, and people like birds, all the way up to the hawks. And if you live in Central Florida, you think, well, what do I care about this food web being out of whack? Everywhere I go, I see red-shouldered hawks, I see ospreys, I see kites. We seem to have a lot of predatory birds at the top of the food chain here. That would seem to indicate we have pretty good food webs. But again, what's your baseline? What are you comparing that to? But at any rate, so Tallamy's whole thing is built on this primary producer, secondary, primary consumer of the little caterpillars. And the idea, again, is that native plants support more little baby caterpillars, and more little baby caterpillars support more chickadees. I think he has estimated that a chickadee, each nest has to consume 9,000 caterpillars to become an adult, a fledgling. So that's a lot of caterpillars. You can imagine these little birds are feeding to their nestlings. And introduced plants, which is the things we most use in our landscapes, support fewer of those native caterpillars. They're not adapted to it. It's not their preferred food source, and therefore you've got fewer caterpillars going up the food chain. That's the idea. And there's a lot of evidence to back that up. How we manage plant affects trophic levels as well. Sweet viburnum is a kind of a horrible plant that most people think, is way overused and we should eliminate. But if you let them grow into trees, they are a hell of a spring pollinator source for mostly generalists, but also some more specialized species. But even something like the Simpson stopper, which is used in landscape, if you trim it all the time, it never flowers properly and you don't get the fruits or anything like that. So how you manage the plant, it's not just what you plant, it's how you manage it. You plant a perfectly good native plant that you never let flower, you're losing one of the services it provides, one of the key services up the trophic web. Social norms are key here because, and I'm going to talk a little bit about a project we have, especially in Florida, most of our new homes are being built in HOAs, and homeowners associations have an effect on what's done on the landscape in those areas. Not only that, the covenant, the developer has an impact, and so does the builder. So all of those things are aligned. Imagine there's a whole industry about planting plants in new developments in Florida. It's a big industry. The industry has been around for a long time and all the pieces have to align. So the reason we have the landscape industry we have is largely due to its plug into the residential development industry in Florida. That's just a fact of life. So to change those, to say we're all going to go plant native plants, or say like Doug telling me, let's all just go out and plant native plants in our yard. That sounds fine. If you're an FNPS member and like me, you're going to go out and do that. But as far as the landscape and what's happening on the landscape, it's difficult for me to think how that's going to happen if there's not a change in the norms that people operate by. And for new developments, that means let's do something different. Let's do something different than we did before. And of course, the developments, every other thing, loss of habitat, water issues, all of that's also affected by development. At the same time, we know it's going to continue to happen, and it is impacting the acreages that it is still consuming. I want to use pollinators as a special case because we've done a lot more work in that area, because they also have this very special relationship with plants. They have an economic service people can relate to in pollinating crops. Here estimated back in the 2012 at being worth $29 billion. You hear a lot of things about, every two out of every 3 bites you consume have to do with pollinators. It's probably not true for everybody, but any kind of fruit, vegetable that's pollinated, it has that importance. And they're a very diverse group. So they're key in that aspect. There's several groups that are very diverse. And if we're interested in looking at diversity and impacts of diversity on the environment or on any other thing we want to measure related to the environment, then diverse groups are good to use as maybe not indicators, but good tools for assessment. And of course, insects are by far the most important organisms by species. And of course, this is probably an underestimate. They're finding that a lot of groups in the insect world are actually more diverse than they thought, but insects make up by far the greatest number of species on the planet. And pollinators, insects, there are other animals that pollinate plants. Oh, you can't hear? Oh, okay. Insect pollination makes up by far the majority of pollination. Yes, bats and other things do pollinate plants, but insects by far the biggest pollinators. And if you look at the groups, obviously the beetles, the Coleoptera, the Lepidoptera, the Hymenoptera, and Diptera are the biggest groups in this graph. This graph is probably outdated because the parasitic wasps, they have discovered are much more diverse than they thought they were. We have a person in our department, Barb Sharonofsky, who studies those wasps. They're much more diverse. They now think that due to those wasps being more diverse than we thought, that the Hymenoptera are the most diverse group of insects, if we were ever to be able to count and identify all the different species. So be it that it is May, these 3 groups, 3 biggest groups, are all major pollinators. And if you look at crops, there's a lot of different kinds of pollinators, but even among the insects, at least for crop pollination, bees account for 90% of crop pollination globally. So butterflies are important pollinators, but they're not important pollinators. They're important pollinators because they're good showcase species and great poster children. They're not good pollinators. They're good pollinators when they pollinate. They just don't pollinate near as much as the bees. Nobody does. And the interesting thing for us in Central Florida is unlike some other animal groups where the tropics are these hotbed of diversity for those groups. Here you see a global map in which yellow is cool and red is hot. You can see the tropics are actually a low point for bee diversity in the world. Most of the bee diversity in the world is at the mid-latitude. So you can see throughout the US, across Europe and Asia and the northern Middle East, and then also in Argentina, southern South America, and South Africa. So for bee diversity, we live in a rich, diverse world. Our bee diversity is more diverse. Our bees are more diverse than the bees of the tropical rainforest. Just in the US, there's 738 species. Here in the 5 major groups, which many of you would be familiar with. I think Florida has about 320 species. And I think in the collection at UCF, 105 bee species have been collected from either what is now or what once was the natural lands at the University of Central Florida. And something we can do to affect those, and we have good evidence that can be done on a fairly small scale, is just plant pollinator. Analyses that have been done in different parts of the world, Britain, the US, show that community gardens, like vegetable gardens where people have community gardens like that, and pollinator gardens are basically support more pollinator diversity than any other urban habitat. That includes natural areas and parks. It makes sense because these areas are concentrations of flowering plants that are attractive to pollinators. And of course, what types of pollinators we're talking about and what kinds of specific associations they might have with specific plants is very important. And that's where we know that the native plants are important. But not only that, the type of native plant is going to have very specific interaction with the pollinators that are in the landscape. And we know what some of those relationships are. I think some of them are probably pretty well known to experts and maybe just people who are native plant fanatics who have gardens and who observe these things. But we get a pretty good sense and can make some pretty good predictions about which pollinators are active on and prefer which type of plants. And it has to do with their evolution, with their mouth parts, probably with long-term co-evolved relationships. But it can really be where you can really learn more about the use of native plants and how individual species interact with the other species. And so what you plant, how you plant it is going to have an effect on what types of pollinators groups it's going to attract. And that's something we do. We've supported a little bit of research on that. Even in a class that I teach, we have students do projects where they go and observe pollinators and they observe what flower they're on or what plant they're on. So we know a lot of the things we do plant in the urban environment, especially the exotic things like the powder puffs and the salvias, the non-native ones, are very attractive to honeybees. Simpson stopper, Yopon holly, the classic, beautiful, native spring pollinator plants will be covered with honeybees in Florida. And I can't imagine that that's not affecting the native pollinators when we have pretty high populations of honeybees here. But generalist predators like that, generalist pollinators like that are attracted to those plants. But honeybees aren't that attracted to anything in the Asteraceae, like a daisy or a rosin weed you'll see them on them, but they're not their preferred plant. So we know that we have those kind of relationships in what you plant in your garden. Some of them will be attracted to both native pollinators and things like honeybees, more generalist pollinators. Some of them will really support very specific kinds of groups in their pollination support. But that's one way anybody can affect the diversity and abundance of pollinators within the limits of the context of their situation. If you're downtown Orlando, it's probably going to be different than if you're living in the suburbs on the edge of a natural area in terms of what kind of species are supported in your own specific space. So to get more natives in the landscapes, one of the things we're going to have to do is change codes. We have to create incentives for developers for new landscapes. We have to have more native nurseries and more native material in the nurseries. If everybody has to drive to Green Owl Gardens to get a native plant, and not everyone's going to do that. And I know we have some great native nurseries that are closer to that and good native material, but the most popular nurseries that most of your residential people are going to do not have a huge array of the available and possible native plants that could be grown in this area. You all know that. And then you need to bring stakeholders together to work on common solutions. And that kind of leads into one of the projects I'm currently involved with, where we're working with the developer. We're working with the nursery through Cherry Lake, through collaboration with Tim Sallin, who led this effort. We're doing it with collaboration with folks from UF. We're also working with the landscape architects who are designing landscapes for this new development. Sunbridge, which is the one that's being built right there next to Slido, which I know is quite controversial at this point in time. But they are trying to, a lot of these new developers on the edge of the city, whether we like it or not, they are building new developments and they are pitching the eco theme. There's two right next to UCF. One seems to be going ahead. The other maybe will go ahead. Sustany and the Grow. They're all trying to theme themselves in some kind of environmentally friendly way. This Sunbridge development has got the eco-life theme, and they are trying to support this ecological theme, having energy efficient homes, supporting native landscaping, having community garden, having beehives on the edge of the development. So these are the kinds of things they want to do. And through the developer, and there's interactions with this collaborative group, they actually agreed to plant an experiment on the edge of their base camp where we're manipulating things like water. We have regular irrigation versus as needed, only if plants are dying kind of irrigation. And then we also have a compost treatment. A lot of new developments are built with urban soils that are mixed, maybe with clay bottom. It's not always great material. And one of the ways you might be able to improve that is by adding an organic compost amendment at the time of development, just to help the plants get established in the soil quality to improve. So they actually planted this experiment. They paid for a fully replicated 16 plot experiment on the edge of their base camp. And they're also agreeing to plant native plants around some of their model homes. Now, I saw one this past weekend, with the past couple of weeks, and it didn't quite follow the design of the landscape architect. So I think they've agreed the next couple of houses they will do this, where they're actually planting all native landscapes around some of these houses and using a lot of native plant material. So that's encouraging. And what I've discovered through this process is it's not just the developer, it's also the builder. Because even if the developer, like Sunbridge, wants to do this and support this and have this done for their new homes, they have to get the builder to go along with it. The builder can say, no, that's going to be too expensive. That's an add-on that if they can prove the cost is more. So going through this process has been very interesting. But again, this is an interesting idea. It's great that they're interested in native plants. We get to do research that will help increase our understanding of the distribution and abundance of pollinators in these systems and what factors it's affected by. So that's great. But it's also, relatively exclusive suburban landscape. And most of the people in urban areas don't live in those landscapes. A lot of people live in areas like downtown that are more urbanized. And there's a whole set of different questions, but related questions that can also be addressed there. But anyway, this just kind of shows you some of the direction, and that's for Florida. There's other regions of the country where promoting native landscapes and designs and use of that material is being promoted. This is just a nice example of a local one where the collaboration of all the different players that would have to come together to make this happen, including truly understanding the scientific underpinnings, have come together on a common project. So it's been kind of fun. It's just getting underway. So I think it's a kind of a brief look at the importance of native plants, but I think no matter what we do moving forward, native plants are obviously key to a vibrant spring, not a silent spring. We have a lot of other things we need to work on, like pesticide use and all that sort of a thing. But we now understand maybe better than we ever did that native plants are the key to supporting the food webs from the insects on up in our built landscapes. So with that, I would take any questions if anybody might have. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bohlen. Everyone, if you're here and you would like to ask a question, now would be the time. So you talked a lot about pollinators and their effect, encouraging them, and how that's beneficial. I know having this hook for people is really, really important, and that's why the monarch has captured people's imaginations as this, going to be extinct very charismatic. Here's something we can do.
Yeah.
Do you think about refining the call to action for native plants to be even more specific? Like, because monarchs are, it's a very specific call to action. Raise monarchs, plant things that monarchs like. This is more like plant native plants.
Yeah, I mean, really, it's a great hook, but it doesn't get you anywhere where you need to be from from a landscape standpoint, or a changing the face of your neighborhood's kind of landscape, we're not going to have milkweed landscapes, right? So it is an interest, and also then the dominant milkweed that people use is the Curaçabica, which is more of a Caribbean kind of milkweed. And we now know helps spread one of the parasitic diseases of monarchs because it grows in the wintertime. So monarchs, beautiful butterfly, and we love them to death. And we have our own milkweeds that we plant, but they're really not a broad candidate for representing the importance of native plants to the food web and the life web of the environments we live in, our landscapes, because they're so specific. Whereas native plants have this more generalized effect. I think the two areas, but I was trying to hit on both because Ptolemy has been more focused on the caterpillars and their base of the food web importance to the upper trophic levels, which includes things like songbirds. And my focus is a little bit more on pollinators. It's the same thing though, to some degree. It's the same thing. So, having those two groups is important, and I think bees are good. I think caterpillars just aren't as sexy as monarchs, but people get the caterpillar through the monarch, so they understand the importance of the food for the caterpillar, and they love to see the caterpillars. Transferring that to an understanding of caterpillars' importance to the food web that most people don't realize. In part related to the chemistry and the nutritive value of a caterpillar relative to the other food sources. It's a kind of a complicated story that isn't as easily captured as the monarch. But I think maybe you see some of the issues of the monarch being a little bit too narrow.
No questions yet in the chat, so I guess. So I've been thinking about, we have a lot of good research. We have Doug Tallamy, we have your research, we have other research on, insect declines. But, one of the reasons why I haven't gone back into academia is because there is enough research to show what needs to be done. There's an inability to make effective policy decisions or policy decisions based on science. And we can see that in our, how plants are on our FLEPC list, they're on our invasive species list, yet they are not banned from the nursery trade. And so, and as a researcher, I know you're trying your very best to get good research done and to get information out there. But what do we do when we have and we have these large scale issues? We have really large scale insect declines and other things that would require action by actors like governments and really, really large NGOs, but we can't.
Well, I do think you see some move in that area, though. There's frustration, I think, whenever we take our knowledge base, which is what we know, and try to use it. I mean, that's really what policy is all about. It's like, well, there's things we know, there's other things that influence policy, obviously, as well. How do we take what we know and put it into policy? And so, for example, the global agreements we have on climate change, no one's anywhere near making any of those targets. And if we don't meet those targets, the climate's going to change pretty much exactly the way the scientists say it is going to. We know that within their error bars, right? So, the notion that we're going to get to zero emissions by 2030 is absurd. It's totally absurd. It's not even within the realm of feasibility yet. It's sent out there. But we are, at the same time, moving towards a lower carbon economy through not just our science, which has to undergird it. People are putting more solar panels in. They're building more electric cars. We're switching to a more electric economy. We have to get our national grid built first. But so, there are policies like that. And then, we did have the encouraging news of the corridor legislation, and Florida Forever has a little bit of resurrection. We've protected a ton of land in Florida, and that's key to all these issues. And then when it comes to using plants, I think people are becoming more generally aware of the importance of native plants. Is it just a little trend or a fad, or can we get on a pathway that broadens it? And I think when you have, some of these entities that are getting involved now in these discussions, including developers and landscape architects, some of whom may have never thought about native plants that deeply before. These little changes happening now that you hope will lead to a different outcome in the future. And that will come along a little bit with policies, because a lot of the things driving, for example, the Sunbridge project and other things like that is the water. People aren't going to get the water permits. They're not going to be able to use the water. Well, not so much shrubs, but things like the turf grasses and things. And of course, the native shrubs and native plants do really well under our natural climate here. So those things will drive some changes too. But I know exactly what you're saying, that we need to make these changes, and they're going to take efforts at all levels, of which policy has to be an important one.
Taylor's asking, is there a list of specific native plants that would be good for homeowners to plant that are good for supporting native bees, like the asters that you mentioned?
Yeah, there are a lot of plants that are good at supporting native bees. I always, and it's a question of how native, it truly is to this area, but firebush is like a standard shrub anybody can grow that supports bumblebees pretty well. A lot of the small flowered plants, like the Urbanization, like the little lantanas, or the scorpion tails and things that have like a smaller flower, are very good for flower wasps and things like that. The asters are really good for leafcutter bees. So dune sunflower, rosinweed, black-eyed Susans. We experiment with these. A lot of people give up on them because they want their black-eyed Susan to grow and then stay nice and next year come back that way. But the only way to grow a plant like that is to let it go to seed and then cut it down, and it's going to reseed. So you have to control the reseeding process to really have those kind of plants do well in a landscape. But those are great for all kinds of pollinators, especially the flower wasps and leafcutter bees, anything in the day. If you have open sunny areas where you can grow daisy-like things, those are great for that. And then the shrubs, the spring shrubs like Yopon holly and a Simpson stopper are great springtime bloomers. If you've got cabbage palms in your yard, great summertime. Salt palmetto and cabbage palms support tons of pollinators because palm flowers are extremely attractive. So that counts as good pollinator habitat in the summer. And then in the fall, any of the fall native wildflowers that bloom in the fall, in addition to things like firebush, which bloom year round. And then I usually throw in non-native things because some of them do well and support specific groups. Maybe it's than others. Butterflies really like some of the deeper corolla flowers that sometimes are easier to find in non-native plants. But there's a whole suite of native plants, and you can get all this information either through IFAS or the Florida Native Plant Society, or if you have questions, you can always reach out to me, and I can tell you if I know, what kind of pollinators will be supported by a given plant. But you can't go wrong with natives for sure. All right, that's fine. Yeah, I've seen. Yeah, the plant finder is great. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's excellent. Excellent source. So if I'm looking at a native plant, I always search. I go to FNPS first just to go, what's the what FNPS is. Sometimes you're looking for more detailed information, you might have to go somewhere else, but that's an excellent source.
That is everything. There's no more questions. So I guess with that, we will wrap it up.
Very good. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for presenting to us, Dr. Bohlen, and wish you luck with all your research.
Thanks. Take care.